Ciao from Pietro. Ciao from the limited edition. This is a new episode of The Independent. The Independent is our little YouTube format where we bring the faces and the protagonists of the world of independent watchmaking, which is our passion. And it's our reason of existing with the limited edition, where we retail officially a number of incredible independent watchmakers. We have today one that is no exception, that is new to us, as we are introducing the brand to the limited edition, and it's Fears Watches, based in Bristol, United Kingdom. Fears is a watchmaker that we've been looking at with a lot of admiration for a long time, and joins the family of the limited edition these days. Nicholas, the owner, the founder, and the fourth managing director of Fears Watches. Yes, because Fears Watches has a surprisingly and fascinating long history behind them, and we're gonna delve into that with my co-host Johnny McElherron, our editor Johnny McElherron from Ireland, who will be live with us as well at the same time as Nicholas. Hi Johnny, how are you?
I am very well indeed, Pietro, and delighted to be getting this opportunity to meet once again Nicholas. We had a conversation about 6 months ago with yourself and David Brailsford in metal, and so it's great to catch up again, and very exciting, Pietro, that it's the introduction of another fantastic brand onto the family at the limited edition.
Absolutely, and a splendid human being such as Nicholas. We've been knowing each other, Nicholas, for a long time now, I want to say, and we've been kind of imagining our collaboration to happen. Welcome, Nicholas, to this episode of The Independents.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for having me on today. And also thank you. I'm very equally excited that Fears is joining with the limited edition. This is, as you said, Pietro, we've known each other for many years, so it's really nice that we now get to work together as well as being friends. I think that's a really, really nice collaboration.
Absolutely. And first, I would like to start from where you are, Nicholas, because it's not just a cool background that you you put together, as we often try to do, to get these lives a tiny little bit more interesting. But you are now based in what was the place of Fears Watches historically, because historically Fears is a trademark that goes back to 1846. As far back as 1846. How proud you are, and can you tell us a little bit more about where you are sitting at the moment?
Absolutely, and you're right. I can't just pull this and it rolls up behind. This isn't a banner. This is real. That's behind me. So I'm speaking to you from Bristol in the west of England, and the reason Bristol is so important to Fears is this is where the company was originally started in 1846 by Edwin Fear. And it ran through until 1976 in Bristol in different locations through 3 different generations of the Fear family. Now, my link to it and why I'm so proud to be speaking to you from Bristol is Edwin Fear was my great grandfather. So this isn't a case that I restarted an old British company by just buying the trademark. It was very much this has been in my blood. Now, there is actually a fun story about how I didn't know about Fears, and I only discovered Fears was in my history while I was doing my apprenticeship to become a watchmaker at Rolex. But
amazing.
I'll come back to that in a moment. But yeah, so it's nearly a year ago that Fears came back to Bristol. So when I restarted the business, I was living in London, and for me, this was always where the company had to come back to. I actually live up in North Yorkshire in York, but every week I get on a train and travel down the country to Bristol. And for me, it's that thing that we are very lucky to have an incredible history with the Fears heritage.
That's amazing.
But you have to pay it respect, I think. If you've got this amazing history from 177 years ago, you can't just say, oh, look, here's our history, without actually doing it properly, which means actually operating the company back in the historic home city. And what's amazing about this location, we're in a beautiful old Victorian paintworks. So these walls behind me were were first put up around the time that Fears was started. But actually across the road is the cemetery where the previous managing directors are buried. And it's quite nice when I walk to work in the morning, I walk past the cemetery and you sort of just have that feeling of they're keeping an eye on me. You know, they're keeping an eye on what I'm doing with the legacy. And I quite like that.
What a story. What a story. And how did it feel, Johnny? I want to ask, how did it feel? Because I went to my grandparents' attic and I found all sorts of, funny historical memorabilia. And one of them was an heraldic sign of our family that then turned out to be actually fake. So for one day we were dreaming about being this kind of aristocratic Italian family from the north of Italy, and it didn't materialize. So, but I remember the feeling that we had when we kind of found this initially. So how did it feel when you found this? I mean, it's something absolutely extraordinary.
I have to say I can remember the moment very clearly. So I was doing an apprenticeship at Rolex. So I was in their head office in their workshop in London, training.
Rolex, another British company, by the way.
Well, exactly. And in London where Rolex was founded. So I'm there learning to become a watchmaker, and I remember basically it's all thanks to a meeting I had with the pension advisor. And it's quite funny. So basically we're talking annual meeting. This is what your pension is. This is, how much you'll be worth when you retire, that sort of thing. And at the end of the meeting, the chap said, right, well, head back to the workshop and remember only 39 more years to go. And I remember I was in my 20s and I remember walking down those stairs thinking, oh my goodness, yeah, I'm going to be sat at the same workbench, servicing pretty much the same watches for the rest of my working life. And I just suddenly realized I didn't really want to do that. So I spent a few weeks thinking about it. And I went home chatting to my parents one weekend. And I said to them, I kind of feel like I might want to do more than just being at the workbench. And don't get me wrong, it's an apprenticeship in watchmaking is not a quick and easy thing. But I was like, I think I want to do my own business. But I had no idea what that would be, what industry, what company, none of that. And this is where it's wonderful to have these conversations with parents, because my mother, she said what only mothers would do. She suddenly said, serving up the roast potatoes for Sunday lunch, she goes, well, darling, why don't you restart the family watch company? And when you can't ask for a better sort of light bulb eureka moment, suddenly going.
And you went which family company?
Exactly. and the thing is, when I had applied for the job at Rolex, my mother had said to me, oh, how funny, it must be in the blood because you had relatives who used to be watchmakers, your great grandfather and his father. But that was all she had said. And when you're told that they had been watchmakers, you assumed that they were, a single person working alone in a workshop, tinkering away, repairing watches. The bit that she had failed to tell me was, as well as being fully trained watchmakers, and interestingly, the first three Fears managing directors actually learnt watchmaking under Maurice Grossman in Glashütte. Which is rather interesting. They actually, in the 1870s, you went to Germany to do your watchmaker training. But anyway, what she'd failed to tell me, as well as being watchmakers, they were also managing directors of the largest watch company in the west of England, a watch company that at one point had 100 watchmakers here in this city and used to build and send watches out to 95 countries around the world. So Fears was a very sizable operation. And yeah, as I say, a eureka moment. When I discovered this, I realized, right, I've got to do this. I've got to work out somehow to bring Fears back to life. And that moment eventually happened 6.5 years ago, when I'd left Rolex and spent 6 months working full time on Fears, and then brought it back to life in November 2016.
Amazing. Johnny, what a story.
It really is. And I was just thinking, Pietro, when you mentioned the coat of arms that you found in your grandparents' attic, I think possibly my grandfather might have sold it to you. So
That's a story.
So, but no, it's incredible. story. And if a little bit of a rarity nowadays, that there's an actual genealogical connection between where Nicholas is, going back to the actual origins of the Fears brand, and the fact that it's an extraordinary story, and it adds gravitas, if you like, to what Fears are today, because it is a family business that has remained within the family, even though it went into a slumber for many decades between around the 1930s, I assume, or no, 1970s.
Yeah, 1976 until 2016. So for 39 years of sleeping, of being dormant. And it's interesting you mention that, because the thing for me is, since day one, I did something a little bit unusual. Was I did two things. I said, firstly, we will always be really open about the fact that Fears closed and then came back to life. You know, it would be very easy. 39 years is short enough that you could kind of gloss over it a bit. You could just be like, oh, well, you know, not much happened in this period. And I say, no, actually, let's be open about it. Let's say the business closed, it disappeared, everything went, and then I've brought it back, because I think that's part of British history as well, British business history, as well as our own history.
I was going to say, it happened to Breguet for nearly 100 years, you know, to stop completely operations. It's a completely normal thing when you have historical firms that were so dependent on technology that was becoming anachronistic across the decades. And can I ask, because the story sounds a lot like an image of the British watchmaking, what happened to British watchmaking altogether. So it's very it's a good example to make that comparison. Was the quartz, the introduction of the quartz technology, one of the elements that brought Fears in 1976 to have to pack up in those days?
So it's not entirely due to quartz, I would say. So with the quartz crisis, a big part of the quartz crisis wasn't actually purely to do with the invention of the quartz movement. It was to do with the fact that by the 70s, a lot of Swiss and of course British companies, they hadn't modernized the way they worked. And therefore, when you suddenly had the market being flooded with more affordable pieces from abroad with quartz movements, very quickly the customer base sort of moved to that and started buying those pieces. I think with Fears in particular, a big element was the third managing director, my great grandfather. He was approaching retirement age, and naturally the business would have passed on to his son. But his son had fought during the Second World War. He had traveled the world, and he basically wasn't wanting to be here in Bristol running the family company. You know, so much changed in society after the war. And so whereas before people would have been like, oh, well, that's just what you do, suddenly you had this new generation of people going, actually, what do I want to do? And so in the end, he got a job working for Imperial Tobacco, and he traveled the world with Imperial Tobacco. So it's sort of that thing where you go, actually, the quartz crisis, there would have been industry things like that, but it was also a very sort of personal family thing that meant that the business then was like, right, it's time to close it. And in a way, I'm kind of glad the business did close. And that sounds really weird to say that. Why? The reason is, if it had kept going and sort of struggling on, it would have been subsumed by some other company, and then eventually by the 90s it probably would have just been a trademark owned by another brand. And then when I pop up in 2016, it would have been much more difficult to have re-trademarked it, reincorporated the company, and basically got it started. So in a way, I'm kind of glad it stopped. And then when I came, I was able to sort of pick up from where it left off. And actually that leads me on to the second thing. You know, I've always been, since 2016, I said, look, we might have the odd piece that is linked to our heritage, And, I know we'll talk about some of the models and the model family shortly, but, we've done that with one family called the archival. But for our other watches, I wanted to do something a bit different and say, rather than just recreating and milking our heritage and our archive, what if we tried to be a bit more clever and went, right, if we look at the watches Fiers used to make, what are the common DNA? What are the common design elements? And therefore create a watch today that embodies those. So imagining if the company hadn't closed and it had passed onto the 4th generation, the 5th generation, and then onto myself as the 6th generation, what would Fiers be making today? And that's what I try to do. I try to create watches that see Fiers as being a British watch company that happens to have a great heritage. The heritage should always be the cherry on top. The cake, that should be the watch itself. It should speak proudly for itself.
That's very...
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think there's a couple of things about what you've just said there, Nicholas. And, the fact that the company did cease trading for those 39 years, it allowed you, when you did decide to revive it and to breathe new life into it, that there was no baggage. You weren't taking on a company that was just drowning in debt or other issues, or had an old management structure in place that needed to be refreshed, let's put it another way, and also allowed you to imprint your own vision of what Fiers should be. And I think that's a very liberating thing. And it has, as you said, mentioning some of the watches that we're going to look at now in a moment, it allowed you that freedom to create Fiers along in your own to your own rules.
Absolutely.
It's from Fiers to fearless, if you allow me that, because you know how so many brands are stuck to whatever success they had in the past, and they find it really difficult to find that creative freedom, forgetting sometimes that in that past, Fiers was a contemporary brand, like any of these brands that were issuing, what we call now the classic timepieces. But those pieces were contemporary of their age. They weren't, sentimentally related to something that happened in the past. So there should be a kind of a push, a compelling push to try to innovate where possible. And it sounds like a dream situation that you found, but of course you've had. You've been so brave to take the challenge on board, because of course the family past and what has been created before by your ancestors must weigh on your shoulders in terms of the responsibility that you may feel.
I think that's a really interesting point, because I restarted the business, I own the business, I'm managing director, but I'll be honest, since day one, the way I felt here is really I'm the custodian, like I'm the temporary custodian of the business. And one of the, as you say, Johnny, I am actually very grateful that I didn't have to, basically be tidying up a mess of a company with lots of debt, a company with, old ways of working, trying to revitalize it and having to fight against an old culture. I am very lucky that, I was able to come in with effectively a blank sheet of paper. But I think this is the big thing, to do it with an idea that this company will far outlive me. And bearing in mind the previous 2 managing directors, they both worked at Fiers for over 50 years each. So that effectively means that from when I restarted the company, what kind of company will it be when I'm in my 80s, and I'm 36 now. So it's weird, because humans aren't used to kind of thinking these huge things like an entire lifetime. But what that does is it has a big impact, and has done since day one of the relaunch, on what we create and how we operate. And it's saying, it'd be very easy to do certain things for a quick win today, but actually would cause long-term damage to Fiers as a company and a brand in, 30, 40, 50, 60 years time. And it's quite weird to have that, where and I mentioned walking past the cemetery where my ancestors are buried. I am very aware that, yes, I legally own Fears, but actually the Fears history and story, it's bigger than me. You can't own that. That's something that is it's owned by everyone. So it's a weird way of explaining it, but it's very much how I operate and why, sometimes people will be frustrated. Why aren't we launching more watches? Why aren't we building more watches? And for me, it's going, no, I want to do everything properly, carefully, and respectfully. That's really important to me.
That's an amazing standpoint, and I think we're gonna now go deeper a little bit in. We have gone through brilliantly, I think, the historical mentions, 1846 to 1976, the brilliant years of the conception of Fears and development of Fears to an international company. Now, 2016, Nicholas revamping the business. Where did you decide that you wanted to start? And I'm gonna ask you that as I'm also thanking those people that are watching this live, and this recording will be available forever on our channel. But as you are live now, feel free to ask any question you may have in your sleeve for Nicholas, for as long as Nicholas is here with us. So what are you wearing today, Nicholas? And again, take us back to 2016. Product-wise, where did you think you were, or where did you think you wanted to start from?
It's a really good question, because I think people often assume that, when you're running a watch company, you have a very mapped out plan of, we're going to make this in this month and this in this year, and this is how it will work. And don't get me wrong, I do have a pin board, over on the other side of the office, which has plans of what we're wanting to launch in the next few years. But I go back to 2016 and I realized a couple of things. One, I was wanting to do Fears and be self-funded. So rather than taking on investment, I wanted to ensure that Fears restarted with my vision, not someone else's vision. And because of being self-funded and, sadly not being super wealthy, meant that, it was a case of selling possessions, selling my watch collection to fund it. So as a result, we relaunched with two pieces, one with a white dial, one with a blue dial. They were both at the time Swiss-made quartz. And a lot of people were shocked by this. And they said, well, why didn't you launch with a mechanical? Well, it was a practicality of not only the cost implication, but also the company back then was just me. So today, Fears is 7 people, but back then it was just me. And I knew that in those first few years, we weren't going to have there wasn't going to be a team. And therefore, I wanted to ensure it kept things as simple as possible, which, of course, a quartz piece like this would. And, when I created the Redcliffe, and the reason it's called the Redcliffe is our watches are named after different locations that Fears used to be in. So the Redcliffe family was named after Redcliffe Street, where the company was originally founded. And then our Brunswick line, of which I'm wearing a Brunswick today, is named after Brunswick Square, which is where Fears had their export division based. So this goes back to the whole thing about being respectful to the heritage. I could so easily put Fears 1846 on the dial and really try and hammer home that old date. But instead, I'd rather be a little more clever, a little more British, a little more understated with the heritage, and just reference it by the names of the watches. And it's also down to things like the model reference. So, for example, the Brunswick family, the model references for each model start with the letters and numbers BS2. And that's actually a little Easter egg. BS2 is the postcode today of Brunswick Square. The Redcliffe family, BS1, which is the postcode of Redcliffe Street. And it's just integrating Bristol and the heritage in, but in a very subtle way, which isn't in your face. Because fundamentally, you should look at the watch and go, what is this watch? Do I like it? Yes or no? And what I realized when I went through the archive and through the old adverts was Fears always made very elegant watches and very understated watches. They weren't loud, they weren't shouting. They were always designed to look as kind of classic, but not stuffy, not old-fashioned. And so that's why when you look at the first Redcliffe with that blue dial or the white dial, it was using lots of subtle things, like the shape of the hands was the shape of the hands Fiers used from 1930 to 1950. The logo is the same as the logo that Fiers had in the 1940s. The silhouette of that watch is actually the same silhouette that Fiers used for most of the mid-century for their everyday watches. But when you look at it, it's a more contemporary design. And I think that's the important thing. It's going, everything has a reason. There's lots of subtle reasons why, you know, it looks like this. But again, the watch should work overall. And I felt with the Redcliffe, it was what I imagined Fiers would have been making in 2016 if it hadn't closed. And then with the Brunswick family, it's very interesting with the Brunswick family because as people will see, it's a cushion case. And when it first came out in 2017, quite a lot of people were saying, oh, well, it's just a copy of a Panerai, because Panerai obviously are very well known for their cushion case. Well, the fact is, we actually were referencing a cushion case Fiers from 1924. Now, Panerai brought out their first cushion case in 1936. So actually, you could argue it's the other way around. Here we've got our cushion case
which is
from
exactly
the 20s.
Which is exactly why I allow myself to define some of the timepieces of the old Fiers as very contemporary, because that cushion case speaks, you know, for itself when you think that it was released in 1920.
Well, if you look at these two watches that are currently showing, so the one on the left with this amazing octagonal faceted case, that's from 1928. We have our rectangular watch from 1930, the cushion from 1924. I mean, between the First and Second World War, most Fiers watches were shaped. They were square, they were cushions, they were octagonals. I mean, the shapes we've got are fantastic. And I love that. It was really interesting to see that Fiers was being very experimental in those early days of wristwatches. Because if you think 1924, we're talking just under 100 years ago, that's kind of when the first proper production wristwatches made their way onto the consumer market. You know, we all refer to the Santos and the Tank, but these were very limited number, very avant-garde pieces made you know, in Paris by Cartier. Interestingly, Cartier was founded the year after Fiers in 1847, and A. Lange & Söhne were founded the year before Fiers in 1845. So it's that 1840s is a very interesting period when lots of brands were founded. I mean, we share a founding year with Ulysse Nardin, so they were founded in the same year, and you know, certainly I enjoy a Peroni beer, founded again in 1846. So it's interesting to see what things were founded.
What a time to be alive!
Exactly.
What a time to be alive. Johnny, I was going to give some space to the lovely audience that is animating our comments zone. There is a question from Paul. Maybe we can pop it on screen and
I was going to wait actually until we looked at some of the development going on with the brand, but sure, we can run it now. And so, Nicholas, do you have any plans or ambition to develop or use alternative movements, or does the price point prohibit this?
Really good question. And it is a question we get asked. It's saying like, oh, when will Fiers make their own movement or something like this? So there's a couple of things to interject here. So at the moment, our watches use primarily ETA movements, except for the Fiers Garrick, which uses the Garrick UT-GO5 movement. Now, I would be lying if I said it wouldn't be, you know, how lovely it would be as a dream to have our own movement. The problem is, and the reason I'd want my own movement, by the way, isn't for any sort of vanity of saying, oh, look, we've got our own movement. It's from a pure practical standpoint of, if we had our own movement, supply of movements would be easier. You know, actually acquiring movements isn't particularly easy, and making sure you're getting them from a good source. The problem we've got is it's just prohibitively expensive. So, you know, the costs of doing a movement for a watch like Fiers would mean that our price point would be more than double, if not triple. And that's after we've spent millions in investment to do that. Now, if you're a company like Garrick or you're a smaller brand, you can do it's bizarrely not easy, but it's easier to do your own movement because you're talking about movements that are handmade, hand finished, built in very limited numbers. Whereas, when you're looking at the Garrick movement, but then you look at the price of the Garrick watch and you can see very much, oh, this isn't a £3,000 watch. The Garrick is just under 20,000.
Yeah.
So
because you have this vision of keeping the brand on the affordable side and how can I say, loyal to what your ancestors created back in the days where Fears was a multinational company of affordable timepieces that were instruments for people to use to tell the time.
Absolutely. So I mean, this is why when it comes to our movement choice, we've stuck with a lot of what Fears did in the past. What is an incredibly solid, accurate, reliable, good quality movement? Now, with that said, it is interesting. This year, we are beginning to move our movements over from ETA because, I don't need to repeat it here, how difficult it is to source ETAs. So we debated whether to go with Sellita, who, I mean, to be honest, I would rate most of the Sellita movements actually higher quality than a lot of ETAs. But instead, we're actually going with Le Jeu Perret. So we are moving our 38mm manual wind Brunswick from, at the moment it uses an ETA 7001. We're actually a launch customer for Le Jeu Perret for their version of that movement. And then for our automatics, we're working on in using in the next few months a new Le Jeu Perret calibre, which offers 68-hour power reserve. It's easier to regulate, beautiful movements. So these movements are, they're more expensive than the ETAs, but they're not prohibitively expensive. So it means that we can still keep Fears in that price point. But as people will know, we have we have the Garrick. We also have our platinum piece, which is nearly 30,000. We're very keen that this is our core, which is in that sort of, I'd say £3,000 to £5,000. That's our core. However, I'm very excited that maybe once a year we bring out a piece in a slightly higher price point, made in smaller numbers, not necessarily limited edition, but smaller production, but it plays and works and is in a different area. So with the platinum, it's all about the hand craftsmanship of that solid platinum case. With the Garrick, it's obviously, working with Garrick, who certainly know a thing or two about how to do a beautiful hand-finished movement. And for me, it's very good to be able to offer these pieces, even though we're not turning our back on the core. And as you said, Pietro, it is for that reason of what Fears used to do in the past. Fears primarily made good, solid, everyday working watches. But they also would offer from time to time a more complicated piece or a piece in precious metal. And so
Absolutely.
I quite like being able to do both. So we're
Yeah,
not turning our back.
It showcases the abilities that you have, and it gives a perception of the brand that is also putting the accent on the craftsmanship that goes behind. Absolutely.
That's it. I mean, the thing is, when we look at where we source our cases, our dial, our hands from, we're working with some of the best manufacturers in the business. And in fact, we tend to be the least expensive brand that they will work with. And I think this is the thing that I get excited about, is saying, if you take say a Brunswick and, it had an in-house movement and was from a big brand, it might be double the price. But the fact is we're using, the same grade and finishing on cases as bigger brands at a higher price point do. And I really like being able to offer watches that when you hold it, it just feels special. I'm a strong believer it feels special. You shouldn't pick it up and notice straight away, oh, it's the finishing or it's the way the dial's made. These are all the little things that come together in a very subtle way that mean that when you wear it, you just know you're wearing something special. And for me, that's what I'm very, very proud of who we work with, because the way we do it is we design a watch, we create all of the technical drawings, and then we go to specific suppliers. So, you know, we will go to a case maker, and that will be different from the crystal maker. And we'll go to, you know, our straps. We work with 5 suppliers to make one watch strap. And we then bring the components to here in Britain, and then we will assemble the watches here. So for me, it means that we have much more oversight, not only over the quality and the quality control processes, but also it's really, really good fun. If you go to, say, Germany, where our dial maker is, and you sit down with them and you start talking about different finishes, you can spend 2-3 hours talking about finishing on one dial for one project. Now, if I was to go to, you know, a white label manufacturer and say, hey, could you make a watch look like this? Yeah, they'll do that, and they'll do it for a price, and they'll go out and work with their suppliers. I like working directly with the suppliers because then nothing makes me more excited and fulfilled in what I'm doing than when I'm sat in a supplier's office and you're working with someone who is very geeky and passionate about the little component that they make. And you see that joy from that person saying, all we've made since the 1920s are watch dials. So we know something about watch dials. And it's just really, that for me is what I enjoy the most.
And it's a great starting point as well, no? Because we have followed the, you know, what Garrick have implemented to come to this internalization of artistic, you know, artisanal crafts that now they can offer in the UK. You know, Bremont is another example. It's taken years and years and years to come to the point where they are getting, you know, some of their production in the UK. But he's taken a lot of internalization before from companies such as La Jouperet or such as Orage, more recently. So it is a process also for you as the MD to kind of internalize all those activities that one day will give you the tools to, yes, maybe make another step and say, okay, now I feel that it is realistic, it is feasible to maybe have a first collection that is partially made in the UK. Or is that in your vision, or is it how you are approaching the thing?
Yes, I mean, that would be a good thing to do. I think it's making sure that, as you say, sort of internalizing certain processes. So the fact is, we hire a full-time watch designer, and we also hire a CAD engineer. So we have the capability of taking everything from, you know, a concept sketch through to production papers. And it's something we also offer to other watch companies. So we have a B2B side of our company where we do design work and engineering work for other watch companies across Europe, which is quite exciting. You know, obviously we don't talk about that side of the business very much, but it's very nice to have that capability. But a big thing for me is, you know, and in my role running the business, is making sure, working out the direction we take things. So I saw in the comment section a comment came in, was about, will the new movements in our watches increase the price of them significantly? And the fact is, it won't. We're keeping the watches at the same price. Now, the reason is we're saying, right, we're using these new movements. This is a wonderful upgrade. But the business has now got to a stage where we can work with our suppliers and say, right, rather than placing an order for 50 cases or 100 cases, we've now got a track record over many years of paying our bills, working with our suppliers. So they're now willing to say, okay, well, I tell you what, if you commit to, say, 500 watch cases this year, we will deliver them in batches of 50 or 100 as you require them, and you pay when you receive them. But as they have a committed order of 500, they're able to then realize certain economies of scale. So the same case that we've been using can actually then come down in price by a little bit, which can balance out what we're doing with a more expensive movement. And it's those sort of things where you go, it's wonderful after 6.5 years to realize that our suppliers have reason to trust us and work with us and help us to do that. I mean, last year we created around 400 watches. This year, we're hoping to do around 600. So we are tiny as a company. You know, we are talking big numbers to us because, you know, I go back to that first year and it was under 100 watches. So big numbers to us. And certainly my colleagues who are in the office around me will be thinking, yeah, we know how much work it is to produce 400 watches. But you know, we are able to now slowly grow, and we've got the reputation with our suppliers, but also the need for 500 watch cases. So we're able to use that. And you know, this is going into the very sort of, you know, inside baseball, how it is to run a watch company. But I think it's an interesting thing of saying, you know, I don't want to see Fears just have huge price inflation where it's like, oh, every year it just keeps going up and up and up, because, you know, we have a very loyal owner base, and I want to ensure that, you know, we are doing that. But at the same time, we are doing these pieces that are more complex in precious metals, and we're able to kind of, open our wings and stretch them a bit there.
It's Johnny, I call up on you as well on the fact that we have talked a lot about, you know, the revival of British watchmaking and
Sure.
how it has to happen in stages. And Nicholas was pointing out before how watchmakers have been going to Germany or to Switzerland to get trained, you know, for years and years and decades after England gave up the role as the leader, you know, watchmaking country long time ago, centuries ago. So what Nicholas is doing, you know, at his age as well, to take a full chance on a project that, yes, looks like a fantastic white canvas, but when a canvas is completely white, it's actually it takes a lot of sweat and efforts to get to anywhere really. But it's symbolizing also with his interactions with companies like Garrick, or his active participation in the Alliance of British Watch and Clockmakers as well. That yes, there is something in the UK, in England, that can be revived and is actually happening. If we compare to what actually was England 300 years ago, watchmaking wise.
I think that England is right now. England is looking back at a time that kind of came to an end in the 1970s, early 1980s, when it was seen as a manufacturing hub for the world, an engineering hub for the world, and exporting its technology, its products all around the world. And that came to an end in around the 1980s. And I think there are, right now, particularly right now, there are a lot of people who are looking at that and thinking, Joe, wouldn't it be great if only there was a chance or a possibility of those days returning? And honestly, it's not going to happen. But when a young company that is establishing itself, manufacturing to those same standards as their fathers and their grandfathers did when they went to work in the foundries or the engineering workshops or the watchmaking workshops, to see this coming along, my point is, there's a real appetite for what Nicholas is doing and what David Brailsford is doing and what the others are doing at Bremont and Christopher Ward, if you like. And further north of the border too, there are great little brands appearing there as well. And they are...
There is a dynamism that we haven't seen in recent decades.
They're trading on a pride that of a heritage once that has almost been lost, I think.
Oh, I mean, I certainly see, you know, I think you look back and a bit like Fears, you know, the country has such great watchmaking heritage. I think why we're seeing today this exciting sort of, as you say, the dynamism and, you know, interesting things coming out of so many different companies at the same time. I think it's a fact that over the last like 5 to 10 years, people have gone, you know what? Rome wasn't built in a day. You can't just recreate an entire watchmaking ecosystem like you have in the Jura. So therefore, what can we do right now today to get going and do well? And I think there's something in Britain that we do incredibly well. And it doesn't sound very, you know, very sexy or glamorous, but it's very vital. And it's basically project management. So if you look at major projects around the world, quite often it will be Brits who are leading and working with all the different moving parts. And actually running a watch company is very much the same. You know, to build a watch like I'm wearing the Brunswick champagne on this bracelet, to build this watch, we're working I would say probably somewhere between 22 and 25 suppliers to build one watch. To be able to do that, I think it's something the British are quite good at doing. We just seem to have it in our blood. We're just very good at, you know, moving all these parts around. And I think what people have done is acknowledged that and said, right, you know what, it's going to be a while till we have British case makers and movement makers and dial makers at a production level standard. So how do we do it right now? It's working with working with the best people. I think the second thing, sorry, I was just going to say this, the second thing is, in Britain, it's also around creativity and design. So when you look at British design, and this isn't just watches, this is, you know, architecture, this is cars, this is all kinds of things. It's always got a graceful yet purposeful function. So it's functional, but it's not quite as sort of Teutonic as you might get in Germany or Switzerland. And it's got a little bit of flair, not as much flair as you might get in Italy or France, but it's a balance between the two. And I think what's so nice is when I look at my fellow British watch companies, and I'm good friends with the owners of these companies, you realize that we approach things with the same sort of thing. We want to make a practical watch, but it's got to have personality and flair. And for me, a big thing is when we're looking at our dials, the dials are hand finished, they're handmade dials. Same with the cases, that brushing done on the top surface, that's done by hand, not by machine. And it's having those things, but at the same time, the watch has got to have soul, it's got to have character, and it's bringing those things together. And I think because the British brands have started going, right, you know what, let's get on and let's do this now and look forward to an exciting future rather than just bemoaning the past and saying, oh, I wish it was like the good old days. It's like, no, there are some exciting days to come.
For sure. And looking at these, like, there is soul in these pieces. And as you say, it's a fantastic story. And
totally.
To hear the numbers that you're producing at the minute and the plans for moving forward, there's one more comment that I need to ask, because no better people to ask than Nicholas and Pietro. But it was Jason's wondering, when is the Fears limited edition coming out?
Well, exactly.
It's a great question. Great question.
There's no answer to that one, Jason, I'm afraid, right now, but I'm sure it's in the pipeline. Yes.
It's not, I wouldn't say it's in the pipeline, but it feels like a natural thing that may happen one day or another. I don't know. I'm talking for ourselves, Nicholas, but we thrive in creating things that are special and are private and dedicated.
Yeah, and I think, you know, when you look at the Fears collection, you'll see it's not a completely wide, extensive collection. That's because I've always been very much a stickler for keeping it quite narrow. You know, we don't bring out a dial color for the sake of bringing out a dial color. You know, if we do something, it's always, you know, with careful purpose. Exactly. And that's also, but what I always, one thing I will say is we have over the years done a few collaborations here or there or special pieces. And what's always quite exciting with them is, you know, Fears has a very distinctive DNA. I you know, myself and my design team, we know what Fears is and where we work. What's always quite fun is when you do work with other people, is it gives you an excuse to play outside of that, you know, color outside the lines a bit. And it's quite nice to explore that once in a while, you know. And I think this is why when doing a piece like the Fears Garrick or the Alliance watch with Christopher Ward, it's allowed us to be working with another company and, you know, having the impact of that, which I think is, it's exciting to do that. But it's always important to make sure you've got enough of your own DNA. You know, for me, the dream is always, if you removed the Fears name from the dial, does it still look and feel like a Fears watch? And if it does, then I feel like I've done my job right.
Totally.
Absolutely.
And it is
Absolutely.
true if you did.
And we are so proud, and I would continue this conversation for hours, Nicholas. I think it's evident that we'll have to do this again. And Johnny, thanks for co-hosting. It's been such an interesting conversation. For those that are watching, yes, Fears is now available at the limited edition officially on our catalog. You find our little listing right nicely in order, as you can see now on your screen. And Johnny, of course, who goes all the praise for doing putting the hard work to review every single piece individually, as we like to, not just, we don't like calling our listing a web commerce, a website, or we like to give a little bit that touch for your own understanding of what every brand, Fears in particular, stands for, and every model that is meaningfully listed on the website, as Nicholas just explained. So what to say, we went well over the time limit that we set initially, but it's been an absolute pleasure. Again, for who's watching here, I think Nicholas is, apart from being a wonderful human being, he's always been very open and honest about everything regarding Fears and how he conceives Fears and he sees Fears developing in the future. So if you have any questions whatsoever, please send across and we'll pass it across to Nicholas. I hope you enjoyed this, Nicholas.
This was wonderful. This is wonderful. And I think, the way I've always seen it as a closing thought is, we're not just churning out watches. We hand build each watch. Each watch carries a unique serial number, and we have that number on our database. When you receive your Fears watch, you'll see on the case back, it has a little seal, a little sticker with the handwritten serial number, which is engraved on the watch, written, and the initials of the person who's done the final quality checks on it. And I think that's the important thing I always want people to understand is, every watch we make is special. And for me, it's incredibly special because it's literally got my family's name on the dial.
One of the most inspiring stories, honestly, Nicholas. We are so happy to finally be part of it. And Johnny, very proud of being representing Fears. And thank you again for putting your contribution out there with all the reviews as well, which I'm sure that our audience will go and look at in the next few days.
My pleasure. Yeah, it's great to see. And look, another young watch brand on making its mark on the scene. It's always exciting to see. And I wish you the very, very best of success, Nicholas. I'm sure that it will the word will continue and your numbers will continue to rise over the coming years. Hopefully we can attract a few of our collectors as well, Pietro.
Absolutely. A big thank you then to Johnny again, and to Nicholas. Thanks for being our guest. And again, we'll do this again. See you very soon.
Thank you very much.